The sun had barely peeked over the horizon when Jack Thompson's old Ford pickup rumbled down the dirt road leading into Whispering Pines Forest. The early morning mist clung to the trees, creating an eerie atmosphere that matched Jack's somber mood. He'd been up all night, tossing and turning, his mind racing with the decision he was about to make. In the passenger seat, a gentle Labrador named Daisy sat quietly, her warm brown eyes fixed on Jack. Next to her, nestled in a worn cardboard box, were her 6 newborn puppies, their tiny bodies still soft and vulnerable. Daisy's tail wagged slightly, thumping against the seat in a steady rhythm, as if trying to reassure herself that everything was okay. Jack's knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel, his jaw clenched tight. He couldn't bring himself to look at Daisy or her pups. The weight of what he was about to do pressed down on him like a physical force, making it hard to breathe. As the truck jolted over a particularly rough patch of road, one of the puppies let out a small whimper. Jack flinched at the sound, his foot easing off the gas pedal for a moment before he steeled himself and pressed on. The forest grew denser around them, the trees closing in on either side of the narrow road. Jack's eyes darted from side to side, searching for the right spot. Not too close to the road, he thought, but not too deep in the woods either. He needed to be able to make a quick getaway. Finally, he spotted a small clearing just off to the right. With a deep breath, he eased the truck onto the grass and killed the engine. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the soft panting of Daisy and the occasional rustle of leaves in the gentle morning breeze. For a long moment, Jack just sat there, his hands still gripping the wheel. He could feel Daisy's eyes on him, full of trust and expectation. She probably thought they were going for a walk in the woods, like they used to do when she was younger. "I'm sorry, girl," Jack muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. I can't do this anymore." With a heavy sigh, he opened the driver's side door and climbed out. The grass was damp beneath his boots as he walked around to the passenger side. Daisy's tail started wagging faster, her whole body wiggling with excitement as Jack opened her door. "Come on, Daisy," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Out you go." Daisy jumped down eagerly, her nose immediately going to the ground as she sniffed the new surroundings. Jack reached in and carefully lifted the box of puppies, setting it down on the grass. The puppies squirmed and whined, their eyes still closed to the world around them. Jack's hands shook as he reached into the truck one last time, pulling out an old blanket. He spread it on the ground next to the box, then gently transferred the puppies onto it. Daisy watched him curiously, her head tilted to one side. "There you go," Jack said, his voice cracking. He straightened up quickly, avoiding Daisy's gaze. You'll be okay here. There's plenty of." He couldn't finish the sentence. The lump in his throat was too big, threatening to choke him. Without another word, he turned and strode back to the driver's side of the truck. As he climbed in, he heard Daisy let out a soft whine. In the rearview mirror, he could see her standing there, looking confused. One of the puppies had started to cry, a high-pitched sound that cut through the morning air like a knife. Jack's hand hovered over the key in the ignition. He could still change his mind. He could still load them all back up and take them home. But then he thought of the mounting bills on his kitchen table, the final notice from the bank about his mortgage, the way his boss had been hinting about layoffs at the factory. He thought of the cost of dog food, of vet bills, of the damage Daisy had done to his furniture when the puppies were born. With a muttered curse, Jack turned the key. The engine roared to life, startling a flock of birds from a nearby tree. In the mirror, he saw Daisy's ears perk up at the familiar sound. She took a step towards the truck, then hesitated, looking back at her puppies. Jack threw the truck into reverse, his foot heavy on the gas pedal. Gravel sprayed as he backed onto the road, then shifted into drive and sped away. He forced himself not to look in the mirror again, but he couldn't block out the sound of Daisy's desperate barks growing fainter in the distance. The trees blurred past as Jack drove, his vision clouded by unshed tears. He told himself he was doing the right thing. Daisy was young and strong. She'd be able to hunt, to fend for herself and her puppies. And someone might find them. A hiker or a camper. Someone who could give them a better home than he could. But deep down, Jack knew he was lying to himself. He knew the dangers that lurked in these woods, the coyotes, the harsh weather, the lack of food. He knew the odds were stacked against Daisy and her pups. But he pushed those thoughts away, focusing instead on the road ahead and the problems waiting for him back in town. As Jack emerged from the forest and merged onto the highway leading back to Millbrook, his hometown, he felt a hollow ache in his chest. The passenger seat beside him seemed impossibly empty. No warm body pressed against his leg, no wet nose nudging his elbow. The silence in the truck was oppressive, filled with unspoken guilt and regret. He drove on autopilot, barely noticing the familiar landmarks passing by. Old Man Johnson's cornfield, its stalks still short this early in the season. The rusted water tower that had needed a new paint job for as long as anyone could remember. The Welcome to Millbrook sign, its cheerful letters at odds with the turmoil in Jack's heart. As he pulled into his driveway, the reality of what he'd done hit him like a physical blow. He sat in the truck for a long time, his forehead resting on the steering wheel, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The weight of his decision pressed down on him, threatening to crush him entirely. Finally, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand, Jack got out of the truck and walked into his empty house. Daisy's water bowl was still by the back door. Her favorite chew toy lay abandoned in the corner of the living room. Everywhere he looked, there were reminders of the companion he'd just abandoned. With a sudden burst of anger, Jack grabbed the water bowl and hurled it across the room. It hit the wall with a satisfying crash, water splashing across the faded wallpaper. But the moment of catharsis was short-lived. As he stood there, surrounded by the remnants of his life with Daisy, Jack Thompson realized that he'd made a mistake he could never take back. Miles away, in the depths of Whispering Pines Forest, Daisy huddled close to her puppies. Her keen ears were alert for any sign of danger, her body tense and ready to defend her vulnerable offspring. As the day wore on and the familiar rumble of Jack's truck didn't return, confusion gave way to a growing sense of abandonment. But Daisy was a mother now, and her instincts overrode her desire to wait for her human to return. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees, she gently picked up one of her puppies by the scruff of its neck. With careful steps, she began to move deeper into the forest, away from the road and into the unknown wilderness that would become their new home. One by one, Daisy relocated her puppies, her determination growing with each trip. By the time night fell, she had found a sheltered spot beneath the gnarled roots of an old oak tree. There, surrounded by the strange sounds of the forest night, Daisy curled protectively around her litter. Her heart ached for the comfort of her old home, but a new resolve was building within her. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them. She would survive, and she would ensure that her puppies survived too. As Daisy drifted into an uneasy sleep, the forest seemed to close in around her little family. The stars twinkled overhead, indifferent to the small drama playing out beneath them. And somewhere in the distance, a lone wolf howled, its mournful cry echoing through the trees, a portent of the adventures and challenges that awaited Daisy and her pups in their new life in the wild. The years that followed Daisy's abandonment in Whispering Pines Forest were a testament to her resilience and maternal instinct. As the seasons changed, painting the forest in an ever-shifting palette of colors, Daisy and her puppies learned to navigate their new wild home. At first, survival had been a daily struggle. Daisy's domesticated background hadn't prepared her for the harsh realities of forest life. She'd spent countless nights huddled with her pups, her ears pricked for any sign of danger, her body tense and ready to defend her little family at a moment's notice. But as days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, Daisy began to adapt. She learned to hunt, starting with small prey like rabbits and squirrels. Her keen nose, once used to sniff out treats and toys, now helped her track game through the underbrush. She taught her puppies as they grew, showing them how to stay downwind of their prey, how to move silently through the forest, how to listen for the telltale rustle of small animals in the leaves. Water was easier to come by. Daisy led her brood to a clear, bubbling stream not far from the old oak tree where they'd spent their first night. The puppies learned to lap at the cool water, their little tongues darting in and out as they quenched their thirst. As the puppies grew, their personalities began to emerge. The largest of the litter, a male with a distinctive white patch on his chest, was the first to venture away from Daisy's watchful eye. Daisy named him Scout in her own way, recognizing him by his adventurous spirit. Then there was Whisper, the smallest female, who moved with a quietness that belied her Labrador heritage. Shadow, another male, was always at Daisy's side, while Rusty, named for his reddish-brown coat, was the most vocal of the bunch. Daisy watched with pride as her puppies grew into strong, capable dogs. They learned to work as a team, herding small game towards each other during hunts. They play-fought, tumbling through piles of autumn leaves or splashing in the shallows of the stream, honing the skills they'd need to survive. But life in the wild was not without its dangers. Daisy never forgot the night when a pack of coyotes had tried to prey on her family. She'd stood her ground, her hackles raised and teeth bared, while her pups huddled behind her. The fight had been fierce, but Daisy's size and determination had won out. The coyotes had slunk away, leaving Daisy with a torn ear and a newfound respect from her puppies. As the pups grew into adulthood, they began to range further from their makeshift den. Scout, true to his name, often led these expeditions, with Daisy watching anxiously from afar. She knew they needed to learn independence, but a part of her heart clenched every time they disappeared into the trees. It was on one of these days, when the forest was painted in the warm hues of early autumn, that everything changed. Daisy had been dozing in a patch of sunlight, enjoying the warmth on her fur, when a sharp bark from Whisper jerked her awake. The sound was filled with fear and urgency, something Daisy hadn't heard since the night of the coyote attack. Without hesitation, Daisy sprang to her feet and raced towards the sound. Her powerful legs carried her swiftly through the forest, leaping over fallen logs and ducking under low-hanging branches. The familiar scents of the forest blurred together as she ran, her focus solely on reaching her pup. She found Whisper at the edge of a small clearing, her tail tucked between her legs and her ears flat against her head. Daisy nuzzled her reassuringly, then peered into the clearing to see what had frightened her daughter. A man stood in the center of the open space, his weathered face partially hidden by a scraggly beard. He wore a flannel shirt and worn jeans, with a rifle slung over his shoulder. At his feet was a collection of metal traps, their sharp teeth glinting menacingly in the dappled sunlight. Daisy felt a growl building in her throat. The man reminded her of Jack, the human who had abandoned her and her pups in this very forest. But there was something different about this man, something that set Daisy's fur on edge. His eyes, when they flickered towards the edge of the clearing where Daisy and Whisper hid, were cold and calculating. For a moment, Daisy considered retreating. She could gather her pups and move deeper into the forest, away from this new threat. But as she watched, the man began setting his traps, concealing them beneath a thin layer of leaves and dirt. Daisy knew these woods, knew the paths that she and her family traveled. The thought of one of her pups stepping into those metal jaws made her blood run cold. Before she could decide on a course of action, a commotion from the other side of the clearing caught her attention. Scout and Rusty burst from the underbrush, playfully chasing each other. They were so engrossed in their game that they didn't notice the man until it was too late. The man's reaction was instant. He snatched up his rifle, leveling it at the two dogs. Daisy's heart leapt into her throat. Without thinking, she charged into the clearing, her powerful bark echoing through the trees. Scout and Rusty, startled by their mother's sudden appearance, skidded to a halt. The man swung his rifle towards Daisy, but she didn't slow her charge. All she could think about was protecting her pups. She launched herself at the man, her teeth bared, ready to fight with every ounce of strength she possessed. But the man was quicker than she anticipated. As Daisy leapt, he swung the rifle like a club, catching her in midair. The blow sent her tumbling to the ground, stars exploding behind her eyes. Before she could regain her feet, she felt a loop of cold metal close around her neck. The man had dropped his rifle and grabbed one of his traps. Now he stood over Daisy, securing the other end of a heavy chain to the base of a nearby tree. Daisy snarled and snapped, but each movement only made the metal collar bite deeper into her neck. "Settle down, you mangy mutt," the man growled, his voice rough with anger. "You and your wild pack have been scaring off game for months. It's time someone did something about it." Daisy barely registered his words. Her eyes were fixed on her pups. Scout and Rusty stood at the edge of the clearing, their bodies tense, torn between fleeing and coming to their mother's aid. Whisper had joined them, her small form trembling with fear. "Go," Daisy barked, putting every ounce of authority she could into the sound. Run. For a moment, her pups hesitated. But as the man turned towards them, raising his rifle once more, they finally obeyed. Scout led the way, disappearing into the underbrush with Rusty and Whisper close behind. The man cursed, firing a shot into the air that echoed through the forest. But Daisy's pups were already gone, swallowed up by the wilderness that had been their home for so long. As silence fell over the clearing once more, Daisy slumped to the ground, the fight draining out of her. The chain clinked as she moved, a constant reminder of her captivity. She could feel a warm trickle of blood where the metal collar had cut into her neck, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the ache in her heart. The man stood over her for a long moment, his breathing heavy. "You've caused me enough trouble," he muttered. "Let's see how you like being left out here." With that, he gathered up his remaining traps and his rifle. Daisy watched through half-lidded eyes as he strode out of the clearing, leaving her alone and chained to the tree. As the sound of the man's footsteps faded away, Daisy let out a low, mournful howl. It was a sound of pain, of fear, but most of all, of longing for the pups she had sworn to protect. The howl echoed through Whispering Pines forest, carried on the wind through the trees, a haunting melody of a mother separated from her children. Night fell, bringing with it a bone-deep chill. Daisy huddled as close to the tree as her chain would allow, trying to conserve what little warmth she could. Her thoughts were a whirlwind of worry for her pups. Had they found safety? Would they be able to hunt without her? Would they try to come back for her? As the moon rose, casting long shadows across the clearing, Daisy's ears pricked up. A twig snapped somewhere in the darkness beyond the reach of her chain. She raised her head, hope and fear warring in her heart. Was it her pups, coming back despite the danger? Or was it some predator, drawn by the scent of her blood and her helplessness? A pair of eyes glinted in the moonlight, and Daisy tensed, ready to defend herself as best she could. But as the figure emerged from the shadows, Daisy's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't one of her pups, nor was it a coyote or any other forest predator she had encountered before. A wolf, larger than any dog Daisy had ever seen, stood at the edge of the clearing. Its silver-gray fur seemed to shimmer in the moonlight, and its yellow eyes were fixed on Daisy with an intensity that made her want to look away. But she held its gaze, drawing on every ounce of courage she had left. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, the wolf began to approach. Daisy's muscles tensed, ready for an attack, but something in the wolf's demeanor kept her from growling or barking. There was a purposefulness to its movements, a sense of deliberation that seemed almost human. As the wolf drew closer, Daisy could see the scars that crisscrossed its muzzle and shoulders, testament to a life of battles fought and won. This was no young, inexperienced animal. This was a creature that had seen much, survived much. The wolf circled Daisy slowly, its nose twitching as it took in her scent. Then, to Daisy's utter astonishment, it approached the chain that bound her to the tree. Powerful jaws closed around the metal links, and Daisy heard the unmistakable sound of teeth grinding against steel. Hope, fragile but undeniable, bloomed in Daisy's chest. As the wolf worked at her chains, she felt a connection forming, a sense of kinship that transcended the boundaries between wild and tame. In that moment, as the moon shone down on the unlikely pair, Daisy realized that her journey in Whispering Pines forest was far from over. A new chapter was about to begin, one that would challenge everything she thought she knew about survival, family, and the untamed heart of the wilderness. The sound of metal grinding against metal filled the moonlit clearing as the wolf worked tirelessly at Daisy's chain. Daisy watched in awe, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and hope. She had never been this close to a wolf before, and despite her dire situation, she couldn't help but admire the creature's raw power and determination. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The wolf's jaws must have been aching, but it didn't give up. Daisy could see flecks of blood on the chain where the wolf's gums had been cut by the sharp edges, yet still it persevered. Finally, with a resounding crack, the chain snapped. Daisy stumbled forward, almost disbelieving. The weight of the chain still hung from her neck, but she was no longer tethered to the tree. She shook herself, feeling a rush of freedom course through her body. Then she turned to the wolf, unsure of what to do next. The wolf regarded her with those intense yellow eyes, then turned and trotted towards the edge of the clearing. It paused, looking back at Daisy as if to say, "Are you coming?" Daisy hesitated for just a moment. Everything she knew about survival in the forest told her to be wary of this predator. But something deeper, a primal instinct she didn't fully understand, urged her to trust. With a deep breath, Daisy followed the wolf into the shadows of the forest. They moved silently through the underbrush, the wolf setting a pace that Daisy could match despite her exhaustion and injuries. As they traveled, Daisy's keen nose picked up new scents, musky, wild odors that spoke of other wolves nearby. After what seemed like miles, they emerged into another clearing. This one was larger, with a small stream running along one edge. And it was far from empty. As Daisy's eyes adjusted to the dim light, she saw shapes moving in the shadows, more wolves, at least a dozen of them. The wolf that had rescued Daisy let out a low howl, and the others gathered around. Daisy tensed, ready to run if needed, but none of the wolves made any aggressive moves towards her. Instead, they seemed curious, sniffing the air and tilting their heads as they studied this strange newcomer. A large black wolf, even bigger than Daisy's rescuer, stepped forward. This had to be the alpha of the pack. It approached Daisy slowly, its posture neither threatening nor submissive. Daisy stood her ground, drawing on every ounce of courage she possessed. She knew this moment could determine her fate. The alpha circled Daisy once, twice, its nose twitching as it took in her scent. Then, to Daisy's surprise, it gently nuzzled the spot where the chain had cut into her neck. The gesture was so unexpected, so tender, that Daisy felt her fears begin to melt away. Over the next few days, Daisy began to understand that she had been granted a rare privilege: acceptance into the wolf pack. The wolves seemed to sense that she was different, not quite one of them but not entirely alien either. They treated her with a cautious respect, and gradually, Daisy started to learn their ways. The first lesson was hunting. Daisy had learned to catch small game during her years in the forest, but hunting with the wolf pack was something else entirely. They moved like shadows through the trees, communicating with subtle ear twitches and tail movements. Daisy watched in awe as they brought down a deer, working together with a coordination that seemed almost telepathic. At first, Daisy hung back during these hunts, unsure of her place. But the wolves, particularly her rescuer whom she had started to think of as Silver, seemed determined to include her. Silver would nudge her into position during a hunt, showing her how to use her speed and strength to complement the wolves' tactics. Slowly but surely, Daisy began to find her role in the pack. She might not have had the wolves' raw power or their razor-sharp teeth, but she had other strengths. Her Labrador nose, bred for generations to track game, proved to be an asset during hunts. And her experience with humans gave her a unique perspective that the wolves seemed to value. As the days turned into weeks, Daisy found herself adapting in ways she never thought possible. Her movements became more fluid, more wolf-like. She learned to communicate without barks or whines, instead using the subtle body language of the pack. At night, she would curl up with the others in their den, her golden fur a stark contrast to their grey and black coats, but feeling more at home than she had since leaving Millbrook. But even as Daisy embraced her new life, she never forgot her puppies. Every day, she would take some time to search for signs of them, hoping against hope that they had survived on their own. The wolves seemed to understand her need, often accompanying her on these searches. Though they found no trace of Scout, Whisper, or Rusty, Daisy refused to give up hope. One crisp autumn morning, as mist rose from the forest floor, Daisy was on one of her searches when a familiar scent caught her attention. She froze, her nose twitching rapidly. It couldn't be, but it was. The scent of one of her puppies, faint but unmistakable. Without hesitation, Daisy took off, following the scent trail. Silver and two other wolves from the pack loped alongside her, sensing her urgency. The trail led them to the edge of a steep ravine, and for a moment, Daisy's heart sank. Had one of her pups fallen? But then she heard it, a faint whimper coming from below. Peering over the edge, Daisy saw a ledge about halfway down the ravine. And there, huddled against the rock face, was Whisper. The smallest of her pups had somehow survived on her own all this time, but now she was trapped, unable to climb up or down. Daisy let out a soft bark, and Whisper's head shot up. The young dog's eyes widened in disbelief, then filled with joy as she recognized her mother. She tried to scramble up the ravine wall, but it was too steep. For a moment, Daisy was at a loss. The ravine was too deep for her to reach Whisper on her own. But then Silver stepped forward, looking from Daisy to the ravine and back again. The wolf seemed to be formulating a plan. What happened next was a testament to the bond that had formed between Daisy and the wolf pack. Under Silver's silent direction, the wolves formed a living chain down the side of the ravine. Daisy, being the lightest, was the last link. She shimmied down the wolf chain, her heart in her throat as loose rocks clattered into the depths below. Finally, she reached Whisper. The reunion was joyous but brief. They were still in a precarious position. With gentle encouragement, Daisy guided Whisper onto her back. Then, slowly and carefully, they made their way back up the wolf chain to safety. Once on solid ground, Daisy nuzzled Whisper fiercely, her tail wagging so hard her whole body shook. Whisper, though clearly exhausted and malnourished, returned the affection with equal fervor. The wolves gathered around, curious about this new addition to their group. As Daisy looked from Whisper to the wolves and back again, she felt a sense of completeness she hadn't experienced since being abandoned in the forest. Her journey had been long and filled with hardships, but it had led her to this moment, a blend of her past and her present, of the domestic and the wild. In the days that followed, Daisy helped Whisper adjust to life with the wolf pack, just as she had done herself. Whisper, young and adaptable, took to it even quicker than Daisy had. Soon, mother and daughter were running with the wolves as if they had been born to it. But Daisy never gave up hope of finding Scout and Rusty. And as winter approached, bringing with it new challenges and adventures, she knew that her journey was far from over. The forest held many secrets, and somewhere out there, she was sure her other pups were waiting to be found. As the first snow of the season began to fall, blanketing Whispering Pines forest in white, Daisy stood at the edge of a cliff overlooking the vast wilderness. Whisper was by her side, and the wolf pack spread out behind them. In that moment, with the wind ruffling her fur and carrying the wild scents of the forest, Daisy felt a sense of belonging she had never known before. She was no longer just a pet abandoned in the woods, nor was she fully a wild animal. She was something in between, a bridge between two worlds. And as she turned to lead her unusual family back to their den, Daisy knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them with the strength and wisdom she had gained from both her past and her present. The wolves' howls echoed through the snowy forest, and Daisy added her own voice to the chorus. It was a song of survival, of adaptation, and of the unbreakable bonds of family, no matter how unconventional that family might be. The years had not been kind to Jack Thompson. The weight of his guilt had etched deep lines into his face, turning his hair prematurely gray. Every day since he'd abandoned Daisy and her puppies in Whispering Pines forest, he'd carried the burden of his actions like a physical weight on his shoulders. At first, he'd tried to justify it to himself. Times were tough, he'd tell himself. He couldn't afford to keep them. Someone else would find them and give them a good home. But as days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, those excuses rang increasingly hollow. Jack had thrown himself into his work at the factory, taking every overtime shift he could get. But no matter how hard he worked, he couldn't escape the memories. The trust in Daisy's eyes as he'd led her into the forest. The soft whimpers of the puppies as he'd driven away. Those sounds haunted his dreams, turning his nights into a torment of regret. His co-workers at the Millbrook manufacturing plant noticed the change in him. Jack, once known for his easy smile and ready joke, became withdrawn and somber. He rarely joined them for after-work beers at O'Malley's pub anymore, preferring to head straight home to his empty house. On this particular evening, nearly 5 years after that fateful day in the forest, Jack found himself driving home in a torrential downpour. The wipers of his old Ford pickup, the same truck he'd used to abandon Daisy, struggled to keep up with the deluge. Jack leaned forward, squinting through the rain-streaked windshield, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. He was so focused on the road that he almost missed the turnoff for Whispering Pines forest. Almost. But as the familiar sign loomed out of the darkness, Jack felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to turn. Before he could second-guess himself, he wrenched the steering wheel to the right, the truck's tires skidding slightly on the wet asphalt. The unpaved forest road was a mess of mud and puddles. Jack's truck bounced and jolted as he navigated the treacherous terrain, the rain hammering on the roof like 1,000 angry fists. He wasn't sure what he was doing here, what he hoped to find. Closure. Forgiveness. Or perhaps just a chance to face the scene of his greatest shame. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the cab, followed by a sickening lurch as the truck tilted to one side. Jack cursed under his breath, realizing he must have hit a particularly nasty pothole. He managed to guide the vehicle to a stop at the side of the road, but when he tried to restart it, the engine only sputtered weakly before falling silent. "Perfect," Jack muttered, slamming his palm against the steering wheel in frustration. He was miles from anywhere, stuck in the middle of a forest in a rainstorm. As if the universe was purposely conspiring to punish him for his past misdeeds. With a resigned sigh, Jack grabbed the flashlight from his glove compartment and stepped out into the rain. The moment he opened the door, the sound of the storm intensified, the wind whipping the rain into a frenzy. Jack was soaked to the skin within seconds as he circled the truck, assessing the damage. It was as bad as he'd feared. The right front tire was completely shredded, and judging by the angle of the wheel, he suspected the axle might be damaged too. This was well beyond his ability to fix with the basic tools he had on hand. As Jack stood there, the beam of his flashlight illuminating the ruined tire, a sound rose above the patter of rain and the rustling of wind-blown leaves. A howl, long and mournful, echoed through the forest. Jack felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He'd heard stories of wolves in these parts, but he'd always dismissed them as tall tales told by the old-timers at O'Malley's. Another howl joined the first, then another. Soon, it seemed like the whole forest was alive with the eerie chorus. Jack swung his flashlight in a wide arc, half expecting to see glowing eyes staring back at him from the darkness. But all he saw were trees and underbrush, their shadows dancing in the erratic beam of light. Jack knew he couldn't stay out here. The truck wasn't going anywhere, and the temperature was dropping rapidly. He vaguely remembered passing an old ranger station a mile or so back. With no other options, he locked up the truck and set off down the muddy road, his shoes squelching with every step. The walk was grueling. The rain showed no signs of letting up, and the wind seemed determined to blow Jack off his feet. Every few steps, he'd slip in the mud, barely managing to keep his balance. The beam of his flashlight carved a pitiful tunnel of visibility through the darkness, but beyond its reach, the forest loomed menacingly. By the time Jack spotted the dilapidated ranger station, he was shivering uncontrollably, his teeth chattering so hard he thought they might crack. The small wooden building had clearly seen better days, its paint peeling and several windows boarded up. But to Jack, it looked like a five-star hotel. He stumbled up the creaky steps and tried the door. To his surprise, it swung open easily. The interior was musty and filled with cobwebs, but it was dry. Jack's flashlight revealed a small pot-bellied stove in one corner and a stack of firewood beside it. With fumbling, half-frozen fingers, he set about building a fire. As warmth slowly began to seep back into his body, Jack sank onto the dusty floor, his back against the wall. The events of the evening felt surreal, like some kind of cosmic joke. Here he was, trapped in the very forest where he'd committed the act that had haunted him for years. Outside, the wolf howls continued, seeming to grow closer. Jack found himself wondering, not for the first time, what had become of Daisy and her puppies. Had they survived that first night? The first week? Had they fallen prey to the very wolves whose cries now filled the night? As if in answer to his unspoken questions, a new sound cut through the storm, a bark, sharp and insistent. Jack's heart leaped into his throat. It couldn't be, could it? He scrambled to his feet, pressing his face against the grimy window. At first, he saw nothing but rain and darkness. But then, illuminated by a flash of lightning, he saw them. A pack of wolves stood at the edge of the clearing, their fur slick with rain. And there, in the middle of the pack, was a dog. A Labrador. Jack's breath caught in his throat. The dog was older, leaner than he remembered, with a few grey hairs around her muzzle. But he'd know those eyes anywhere. It was Daisy. For a long moment, Jack stood frozen, unable to believe what he was seeing. Daisy was alive. She'd survived. And somehow, impossibly, she'd found a place among the wolves. Before he could fully process this revelation, Daisy's head snapped towards the ranger station. Even through the rain-streaked glass, Jack could see the moment of recognition in her eyes. She took a step forward, then another. Jack's hand was on the doorknob before he realized what he was doing. He knew it was foolish, dangerous even. These were wild animals, and he was unarmed, alone. But the need to make amends, to seek forgiveness, overrode all sense of self-preservation. He opened the door and stepped out onto the porch. The rain had eased to a gentle drizzle, and in the silence that followed, Jack could hear his own heart pounding. "Daisy," he called softly, his voice cracking with emotion. The Labrador stopped, her ears pricked forward. The wolves behind her growled low in their throats, hackles rising. But Daisy held her ground, her eyes never leaving Jack's face. Slowly, carefully, Jack descended the steps. He could feel the wolves' eyes on him, tracking his every move. But his focus was entirely on Daisy. He stopped a few feet away from her, then slowly sank to his knees in the mud. "I'm sorry," he whispered, tears mingling with the rain on his cheeks. "I'm so sorry." For what felt like an eternity, Daisy didn't move. Then, with a soft whine, she padded forward. Jack held his breath as she approached, half expecting her to bare her teeth, to exact revenge for his betrayal. But there was no anger in Daisy's eyes, no desire for retribution. Instead, she pressed her wet nose against Jack's hand, her tail wagging hesitantly. The simple gesture of forgiveness broke something inside Jack. He wrapped his arms around Daisy's neck, burying his face in her damp fur as sobs racked his body. All the guilt, all the regret he'd carried for years poured out of him. The wolves watched this reunion with wary curiosity. One of them, a large silver-gray male, took a step forward. Jack tensed, but Daisy turned and let out a soft bark. To Jack's amazement, the wolf stopped, then sat on its haunches. As the storm clouds began to part, revealing a star-studded sky, Jack found himself in a moment he could never have imagined. Surrounded by wolves, with Daisy by his side, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. He knew that come morning, things would be complicated. He couldn't undo the past, couldn't erase the years of separation. Daisy had a new life now, a new family. But for this moment, in the quiet aftermath of the storm, it was enough to know that she had survived, that she had thrived. And as Daisy leaned against him, her familiar warmth a balm to his battered soul, Jack Thompson began to believe that maybe, just maybe, redemption was possible after all. As the first light of dawn broke over Whispering Pines Forest, Jack Thompson found himself in a situation he could never have imagined. He sat on the worn wooden steps of the old ranger station, a cup of lukewarm coffee clutched in his trembling hands. Beside him, her head resting on his knee, was Daisy. And surrounding them, in a loose semicircle, was the wolf pack. The night had been a blur of emotions for Jack. After the initial shock of their reunion had worn off, he and Daisy had retreated to the relative safety of the ranger station. The wolves, seemingly at Daisy's silent command, had kept their distance but remained vigilant, their eyes gleaming in the darkness. Now, in the pale morning light, Jack could hardly believe what he was seeing. Daisy, the dog he had shamefully abandoned years ago, was not only alive but thriving. Her coat, though bearing a few scars, was healthy and thick. Her eyes, once full of confusion and hurt, now shone with a wisdom and strength that took his breath away. As for the wolves, Jack couldn't help but marvel at their presence. He counted at least 8 of them, their fur a mix of greys, blacks, and browns. The largest, a silver-grey male that seemed to be the leader, sat closest to them, its intelligent eyes never leaving Jack's face. "What do I do now, girl?" Jack murmured, more to himself than to Daisy. But Daisy's ears perked up at the sound of his voice, and she let out a soft whine. Jack's mind was racing. He couldn't very well take Daisy back to Millbrook, could he? She had a new life here, a new family. And yet, the thought of leaving her again, of walking away from this miraculous second chance, made his heart ache. As if sensing his inner turmoil, Daisy stood up and stretched. Then, with a quick glance at Jack, she trotted over to the wolf pack. Jack watched, amazed, as she seemed to communicate with them through a series of soft barks and body language he couldn't begin to understand. After what seemed like an eternity, Daisy returned to Jack's side. She tugged gently at his sleeve with her teeth, then looked towards the forest path. "You want me to follow you?" Jack asked, hardly daring to believe it. Daisy's tail wagged in response, and she took a few steps down the path before looking back at him expectantly. Jack hesitated for just a moment. He thought of his job back in Millbrook, of his empty house and the life he'd been sleepwalking through for years. Then he looked at Daisy, at the wolf pack, at the wild beauty of the forest around him. And he made his decision. "Okay, girl," he said, rising to his feet. "Lead the way." What followed was unlike anything Jack had ever experienced. With Daisy as his guide and the wolf pack as their escorts, he ventured deeper into Whispering Pines forest than he had ever gone before. The wolves moved like shadows through the underbrush, their movements so fluid they seemed to be part of the forest itself. As they traveled, Jack began to see the forest through new eyes. He noticed things he had never paid attention to before, the way the morning dew clung to spiderwebs, turning them into delicate jeweled nets, the subtle changes in the forest floor that indicated well-worn animal trails, the symphony of bird calls that filled the air. After about an hour of walking, they emerged into a small clearing. Jack's breath caught in his throat as he took in the scene before him. A pristine stream gurgled through the center of the clearing, its clear waters sparkling in the morning sunlight. On the far bank, nestled between the gnarled roots of an ancient oak tree, was what could only be described as a den. And there, peeking out from the den with curious eyes, were puppies. Not newborns, but young dogs, maybe a few months old. Their coats were a mix of Labrador gold and wolf grey, their ears slightly more pointed than a typical lab's. "Are they?" Jack couldn't finish the question, his voice choked with emotion. Daisy's tail wagged furiously as she bounded across the stream towards the den. The puppies tumbled out to meet her, yipping excitedly. As Jack watched, he realized these must be Daisy's grandchildren, the offspring of one of her original pups and a wolf. The sight filled Jack with a complex mix of emotions. Joy at seeing this tangible proof of Daisy's survival and adaptation. Awe at the unique blending of domestic and wild. And a deep, aching sadness for all the years he had missed, for the journey he should have been part of. As if reading his thoughts, Daisy looked back at Jack and let out a soft bark. Then, to his amazement, she began to herd the puppies towards him. The little ones hesitated at first, eyeing Jack warily. But with gentle encouragement from Daisy and curious sniffs from the adult wolves, they gradually approached. Jack sank to his knees, holding out his hand for the puppies to investigate. Their wet noses tickled his palm as they sniffed him, and he couldn't help but laugh, a sound of pure joy that he hadn't made in years. As the puppies grew bolder, clambering over Jack's legs and tugging playfully at his shoelaces, he felt something shift inside him. The guilt and regret that had been his constant companions for so long began to loosen their grip. In their place, a sense of purpose began to take root. Jack looked around the clearing, seeing it with new eyes. He saw the fallen branches that could be used to reinforce the den, the wild berries growing nearby that could supplement the pack's diet. He thought of his skills as a handyman, honed over years of maintaining his own home and helping neighbors with odd jobs. "I could help," he said softly, almost to himself. I could make things better for them." Daisy, who had been watching Jack's interaction with the puppies, tilted her head at the sound of his voice. She padded over to him and rested her head on his shoulder, a gesture so familiar it made Jack's heart ache. In that moment, Jack Thompson made a decision that would change the course of his life. He couldn't undo the past, couldn't erase the years of separation and the pain he had caused. But he could do better going forward. He could be the man, the friend, the protector that Daisy had always believed him to be. "I'm staying," he announced, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I'm going to make this right, Daisy. I promise." The wolves, who had been watching this exchange with wary curiosity, seemed to sense the shift in Jack's demeanor. The silver-gray leader approached, its yellow eyes locked on Jack's. For a tense moment, man and wolf regarded each other. Then, slowly, the wolf lowered its head, not in submission, but in acceptance. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting dappled shadows across the clearing, Jack began to plan. He would need supplies from town, tools to build proper shelters, maybe even some books on wolf behavior and forest ecology. It wouldn't be easy. He knew he was walking a fine line between helping and interfering with the natural order. But with Daisy by his side, bridging the gap between his world and that of the wolves, he felt ready to face the challenge. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with potential dangers and obstacles. Jack knew that his decision to stay would raise questions back in Millbrook, that he was leaving behind the safety and familiarity of his old life. But as he sat there in that sunlit clearing, surrounded by the unlikely family Daisy had forged, he felt more alive than he had in years. This was his chance at redemption, his opportunity to make amends not just to Daisy, but to the natural world he had taken for granted for so long. As one of the wolf-dog puppies crawled into his lap, its tiny tail wagging furiously, Jack felt a smile spread across his face. "Well," he said, scratching behind the pup's ears, "I guess this is the start of a new adventure, huh?" Daisy's answering bark echoed through the clearing, a joyful sound that seemed to Jack like a promise of forgiveness, of new beginnings, and of a future filled with the wild, untamed spirit of Whispering Pines Forest. The months that followed Jack Thompson's decision to stay in Whispering Pines Forest were filled with challenges, triumphs, and a profound sense of purpose. True to his word, Jack dedicated himself to making life better for Daisy, her wolf-dog puppies, and the wolf pack that had become their family. His first order of business was to return to Millbrook, a trip that felt surreal after his experiences in the forest. The town seemed smaller somehow, the concerns of its residents trivial compared to the raw, vital existence he'd glimpsed in the wild. Jack quit his job at the factory, much to the bewilderment of his co-workers and boss. He sold his house, keeping only what he could fit in his old Ford pickup. When asked about his plans, Jack was vague, muttering about getting back to nature and finding himself. The truth, he knew, would be too fantastical for anyone to believe. Who would understand that he was leaving to live among wolves, guided by the dog he had once abandoned? With his truck loaded with supplies, tools, books on wildlife, first aid kits for both humans and animals, and enough non-perishable food to last months, Jack returned to the forest. He set up camp near the clearing where Daisy and the wolves had their den, careful to maintain a respectful distance. The early days were hard. Jack's body, softened by years of factory work, ached from the physical labor of building shelters and hauling water. The wolves, apart from Daisy and her immediate family, remained wary of him. There were nights when the eerie howls echoing through the darkness made him question his decision, wondering if he was foolish to think he could bridge the gap between his world and theirs. But Daisy was always there, her steady presence a constant reminder of why he had chosen this path. She seemed to sense when his resolve wavered, appearing at his side to offer a comforting nuzzle or a playful bark that never failed to lift his spirits. Slowly but surely, Jack began to find his place in this new world. He built sturdy lean-tos near the den, providing shelter for Daisy and the puppies during storms. He learned to move quietly through the forest, his steps becoming almost as silent as those of the wolves. His eyes, once blind to the subtle signs of forest life, began to pick up on tracks, markings, and the myriad small details that told the story of the wilderness. The wolf pack, led by the silver-grey alpha Jack had come to think of as Shadow, gradually accepted his presence. It started small, Shadow allowing Jack to approach closer during meals, the other wolves not immediately bristling when he entered the clearing. But over time, it grew into something more profound. One crisp autumn morning, Jack was gathering firewood when he heard a commotion from the direction of the den. He rushed back to find one of the younger wolves caught in an old hunting trap, its leg bleeding and mangled. The other wolves circled anxiously, but none seemed to know how to help. Without hesitation, Jack approached. The injured wolf snarled at first, fear and pain making it lash out. But Daisy was there in an instant, placing herself between Jack and the wolf, her posture calm but firm. The wolf quieted, and Jack was able to carefully disarm the trap and free its leg. Using the first aid skills he'd learned, Jack cleaned and bandaged the wound. The wolf remained still throughout the process, its eyes never leaving Jack's face. When he finished, the wolf limped a few steps away, then turned back to regard Jack with a new respect in its gaze. From that day on, the dynamic between Jack and the pack shifted. They began to include him in their hunts, using his human ingenuity to drive prey or scout ahead. Jack found himself slipping into the pack hierarchy, not as a wolf, but as a unique ally with his own role to play. As winter approached, Jack's concerns grew. He knew the harsh months ahead would be challenging for the pack, especially with the young wolf dog puppies who weren't as hardy as their full wolf cousins. He spent weeks preparing, setting up winter dens insulated with leaves and grass, and stockpiling as much food as he could. The first major snowstorm hit in early December, blanketing the forest in white. Jack huddled in his shelter, worry gnawing at him as he listened to the wind howling outside. But when morning came and he emerged to check on the pack, he found them not just surviving, but thriving. The wolves and wolf dogs played in the snow, their thick winter coats keeping them warm. Daisy bounded through the drifts, her golden fur stark against the white landscape, her eyes bright with joy. As he watched them, Jack felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the fire he'd built. This, he realized, was what it meant to be part of something greater than himself. To be accepted, trusted, needed. The winter passed in a blur of crisp, cold days and long, starry nights. Jack's beard grew long and wild, his hands became calloused from constant work, and his body grew lean and strong. He found himself talking less and listening more to the wind in the trees, the crackle of ice on the stream, the distant cries of owls in the night. When spring finally arrived, bringing with it new growth and the return of migratory birds, Jack barely recognized himself as the man who had first stumbled into this forest, weighed down by guilt and regret. Those feelings hadn't disappeared entirely, he doubted they ever would, but they no longer defined him. One warm evening, as the sun was setting and painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Jack sat at the edge of the clearing, Daisy by his side. The wolf dog puppies, now nearly grown, played nearby under the watchful eyes of their wolf parents. Shadow, the alpha, lay a short distance away, his powerful body relaxed but alert. "We did good, didn't we, girl?" Jack murmured, scratching behind Daisy's ears. She leaned into his touch, her tail thumping against the ground in contentment. As if in response to his words, a chorus of howls rose from the forest. Jack recognized the voices now, the deep, resonant call of Shadow, the higher-pitched yips of the younger wolves, and threaded through it all, the unique wolf-dog howls of Daisy's grandchildren. Without thinking, Jack tilted his head back and added his own voice to the chorus. His howl was rough, unpracticed, more of a prolonged shout than a true wolf call. But it blended with the others, becoming part of the wild symphony that echoed through Whispering Pines forest. As the howls faded away, Jack felt a profound sense of peace settle over him. He thought of his old life in Millbrook, of the man he used to be, and it felt like remembering a dream. This wild, beautiful, challenging life was his reality now. He knew there would be more challenges ahead. The forest was not a forgiving place, and the delicate balance between helping and interfering with nature was one he would always have to navigate carefully. But for the first time in years, Jack Thompson felt truly alive, truly purposeful. As the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Jack stood up, brushing pine needles from his worn jeans. "Come on, Daisy," he said softly. "Let's go home." Daisy rose and trotted after him as he made his way back to his shelter. The wolves watched them go, their eyes gleaming in the twilight. And as Jack settled in for the night, the forest around him alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures awakening, he said a silent prayer of thanks to whatever twist of fate had led him back to this place, back to Daisy, and ultimately, back to himself. In the years that followed, legends began to spread in the towns surrounding Whispering Pines forest. Hikers reported glimpsing a wild-looking man moving silently through the trees, always accompanied by a golden Labrador and a pack of wolves. Some claimed he was a ghost, others a forest spirit. But to Jack Thompson, he was simply a man who had found redemption in the most unexpected of places, and who continued to make his offerings to the night not out of guilt or obligation, but out of love for the remarkable family he had found in the heart of the wilderness.